Big questions for the government about how honest they were in the lead up to last week's budget. Why those questions are being asked, we'll discuss on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. And if you would like to listen to every single daily episode of the podcast, you can scan the QR code that you can see right now. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Dharshini in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And here we are talking about the budget again, but we're not talking about what taxes are going up when or what public spending is increasing. We're all talking about who knew what in the Treasury when, about how the public finances were looking. And then just as we were getting ready to record this episode of Newscast at tea time on Monday, we got the news that the head of the Office of Budget Responsibility, the watchdog at the centre of a lot of this, Richard Hughes, is resigning. This is because people could get access to their take on the budget, which is meant to be released after Rachel Reeves spoke in the House of Commons. It was available on their website before. So, Chris, which one would you like to start with first?
Well, I reckon for newscasters, we should start with the resignation, because that's come most recently, hasn't it? In the last couple of hours as we record at 20 to 7 on Monday evening. So I reckon go with that, which is very much Dharshini's wheelhouse rather than mine. But I reckon we go with that first.
Dharshini, take it away.
Well, this is fascinating, isn't it? This is Richard Hughes, who has been in post many years,
5 years.
5 years, thank you very much. Just had his term renewed this summer as well, so looking forward to another stretch. But he has resigned over what effectively is an issue of operational resilience rather than being one about, his fiscal judgment. And he is employed ultimately as an economist. He's been a fairly widely respected economist. But this is about the fact that that report was released before the Chancellor had even stood up, unusually. It was accessed over 40 times on the website, and therefore there was a lot of interest about how this market-sensitive data made it to where it got to. And the answer was the OBR report says this was the worst episode in its history. It's not to do, however, with, crypto criminals. It's not to do with, as they put it, connivance between people who worked at the OBR and elsewhere. No, it's simply a system that wasn't up to scratch for such an important organisation, and a system which was handled perhaps in the incorrect way as well. They assumed that if you put something on it, it didn't go live until it went live, but actually people could access it.
Yeah, and Dharshini, you've got the old-fashioned black and white paper copy of this document in front of you. So it's the EFO, the Economic and Fiscal Outlook.
EFO. And this is, forget the budget red book. This is the absolute Bible. If you want to know not just what the measures are, but what they mean and what the forecasters think is going to happen to our economy and our finances over the next few years, this is what you look at. So the minute we were able to see this thing that day, we knew exactly what was in the budget and what it would mean as well.
Kind of about an hour before.
Yeah.
And in terms of what's happened today, we got the official investigation into what happened at the OBR. Done by the OBR with some outside experts.
Yes, yeah.
And they basically said anyone who's ever made a website has probably used some software called WordPress.
Yes.
And WordPress allows you to upload documents to your website, but you have to have certain settings in place so that those documents are not discoverable by people who might guess what the web address is and type it in. And this is what's happened in this case. And it's intriguing looking at the timeline, because somebody was doing this little thing of if I type in November, using the title of the document from March, but put November instead of March, I might find that somebody was trying that at 5:15 on budget day in the morning.
And not just at 5:15 on budget day. Guess what? This happened before, in March. And what we don't know, and what in Parliament has been discussed today, is could this have happened to other chancellors in the past? Now, this matters because this is market-sensitive information. And if you have hold of it and you work in the bond markets or in the stock markets, and you're able to act on that information before anybody else has it, you can obviously make a lot of money. So it really does matter. And you can see why it is. This has been taken quite so seriously. But ironically, we're sitting here talking about that rather than, as you say, what taxes went up and the impact of those.
I love the idea, though, this of being an issue of operational resilience. I think that was the elegant phrase you used.
We've all been there.
For what is, it was a cataclysmic cock-up, wasn't it? And I don't think I'll forget that moment from last Wednesday of sitting in the studio with Faisal and Vicky and just, what? Hang on? Really? Extraordinary. And human beings were all fallible, etc., etc. And there's no doubt one or two folk who are thinking, oh my goodness, what did we do, etc. But dearie me, what a thing.
I suppose, though, this is me being a bit pedantic here, and I'm going to sort of fall halfway between Darshini's operational thing and your massive explosion of extraordinariness. In that it wasn't a leak.
No.
Was it? Because a leak suggests like an intentionality of somebody to get some information out there. It wasn't a leak, but equally it wasn't a hack either, because it wasn't somebody being incredibly underhanded and using some criminal technique to get access to information that they shouldn't have had access to.
It's sort of almost, is it, the kind of digital equivalent of, leaving it on the seat on the bus?
Yeah, it was, wasn't it? I was going to say a vulnerability. I was probably again being slightly too subtle in that. But I mean, it's extraordinary though, because it's a real eye opener for people who aren't that familiar with the way the OBR works, right? Because you talk about WordPress, and many small and medium-sized businesses would use that kind of software to upload stuff. And that is the way that the OBR operates. It prides itself on being autonomous, and that's why it got permission to use this
rather
than
.gov.uk.
Yeah. And then, therefore, it acted in such a way, it's got quite a small budget. And when you go and visit the offices, it is they're literally crammed in all these sort of very earnest, many quite young looking number crunchers working away at their numbers. And it does have that sort of mentality of a small organisation.
It's about 52 staff, isn't it?
Which doesn't sound that small, doesn't it? But their budget isn't that. I mean, it's a few £1 million, which for an organisation which handles sensitive information, obviously, isn't a huge amount as well. So things will change as a result. But it's fascinating because it has shifted the focus somewhat away from the other issues we've been talking about in the last few days.
Right. Let's talk about the more purely political world now. And Chris, you've written a piece for the BBC News website today, which is headlined, Chris Mason, why, in my judgment, Reeves was misleading on one specific point. Obviously, Reeves being Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor. Do you want to just explain the piece that you've written that has that headline?
Yeah. So
sorry, that sounded a bit accusatory.
No.
Like line of duty.
No, that's absolutely fine. No, and it's fair actually to ask that question in that way, because it's relatively rare, not unprecedented, but relatively rare that I will make as sort of, being transparent about it, as big a judgment call around something like this. But I found myself thinking over the weekend, having covered every twist and turn, or almost every twist and turn of the pre-budget and indeed post-budget process, what was it that we were told and what were we not told? And how would I answer the question if it was put to me on the air, do you think you, and by extension our audience, was misled? That kind of judgment issue that is at the core sometimes of my job, which on behalf of our newscasters and wider audience is to call the story in terms of how I see it, based rigorously on an assembly of the facts. And when we assembled those facts over the weekend and looked back at our notes and what we'd been briefed and what the Chancellor had said back at the beginning of last month, that was the judgment I came to. And I'll just quickly sort of walk you through it. So we had that news conference, didn't we, that the Chancellor held at breakfast time at the beginning of last month, so the best part of a month ago. And that was novel and it was voluntary. It was unprecedented, really, for a Chancellor to conduct and have that sort of occasion prior to her budget. She wanted to lay the ground for what was to come, to pitch roll, to use the Westminster vernacular, in other words, prepare people for what was to come. There is no doubt that she faced some really tricky decisions. There's also no doubt, by the way, that loads of the things that she set out in that news conference came to pass in the budget. She talked, she talked without saying it absolutely explicitly, the taxes have been going up, and they did. She talked about wanting to do stuff to help with the cost of living, and there were those measures. She talked about wanting to build more so-called headroom against the self-imposed fiscal rules that she has to reassure the markets, and she did that. The thing that is at the crux of all of this is not that she said anything in that news conference that was wrong. She didn't. But she emphasised in painting a pretty bleak picture about the situation she confronted, something she had received from the OBR, the forecaster, around forecasts for productivity growth. a measure of. In fact, Dharshini, here's me about to define productivity. I've got to stop here, interrupt my monologue, and say, let's have a proper definition of productivity.
You could do a human footnote.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is about the potential, economic potential of the economy, how efficient we are and how that's performing. And we've known for years that we have not been performing in the way we could be performing, and it has disappointed. But they had decided to do a review of how that works. And obviously, the less productive an economy is, the less its potential, the less money it tends to bring in terms of tax revenue, and the more it tends to spend out. As a result. So this downgrade, which has been focused on, as Chris says, at the time, and also today, I thought it was very telling, Chris, and be interested to hear what you think about this, very telling that there was a doubling down by the Prime Minister and indeed other ministers, James Murray, also Darren Jones earlier on today, doubling down on this. This caused a £16 billion worsening in our public finances. But I hope you don't mind, Chris, I'm going to do that spoiler alert thing. The bit they didn't talk about, obviously, is the thing that had many people puzzled in the economics community was this idea that we also know, or it was gradually fed out, that there was an improvement on the other side of things because of what had happened with inflation and wage growth. And in actual fact, the OBR's
the government was taking in more in
taking in more money. Yeah, that's the irony of having the most stubborn inflation in the G7. It brings in more money, right? And if you look at the numbers, they kind of balance each other out. And the OBR specified this in its letter on Friday. Now, what had a lot of the economics community puzzled, Chris, back in November, when we suddenly had this, hang on a minute, it's come to light, things are looking a bit better. They're saying, no, but the OBR would have had this information and presented it to the Chancellor as part of the forecasting round in October.
Yeah.
So in other words, if Rachel Reeves was giving the full picture of the public finances at her breakfast speech she did in Downing Street a couple of weeks before the budget, she would have been in possession of the information about the downgrade on productivity, but also the upgrade on how much the government was taking in taxes because of inflation, and a totally honest 100% picture of the public finances. She would have mentioned both, but Chris, she didn't mention the latter.
That's right. So again, we should be absolutely specific here because, if you are the Chancellor and you are approaching a budget and you're thinking, my goodness, this budget's going to have to be quite big, even though I said last year we'd do one big budget, and you want a lot more headroom and you're looking at the numbers and they're not great, and you hear about the productivity downgrade, you're going to think, oh, gulp. Everything else being equal, things have just got even harder still. Also, and I'd picked this up privately from various folk in government, and the Prime Minister acknowledged it publicly today, they were really irritated about the OPR doing this on productivity because they thought maybe it could have happened last year or the year before, and it sort of music stopped on them. So they were confronting this difficult situation. They were contemplating, and again, the Prime Minister confirmed this publicly today on camera, they were contemplating smashing their manifesto commitments about income tax rates. And the gap between the numbers in the spreadsheets that they had seen and where they wanted to get to in terms of headroom and then all of the other things they wanted to prioritise in the budget was a big old leap. And that, I don't sort of dispute that in terms of where they were, both numerically and, if you like, psychologically on the morning of that news conference. But the absolute crux of this, and I've reread the Chancellor's speech from the beginning of November, is she lent in very heavily on productivity. But there was no mention of this whole issue around the increase forecast in tax receipts. However, fast forward 10 days on from that news conference, where plenty of us in the room that day, in the light of what we've discovered since, feel that we were misled. Fast forward on 10 days on from that news conference, so still before the budget, the Financial Times got a story. In fact, it was when you were doing your marathon, wasn't it, Adam? Your Newscast 25-hour marathon. The Financial Times got a story that said, actually, the Treasury has decided, or the government has decided, that after all, it doesn't think it needs to change income tax rates. And there was a bit of a period of radio silence with various people in government not saying very much in response to that. And then I had various conversations in the mid-morning of the day after the Friday morning where they were clearly irritated that there'd been this leak to the Financial Times. And they said, well, because obviously the question was, well, if you're not doing that, how do you make your numbers add up? Because you were sounding pretty bleak 10 days ago. And they said, well, actually, tax receipts are better than we thought. So at that point, they were willing to use a argument around tax receipts that they hadn't been willing to use 10 days previously. And the reason they used it at that point was they were worried about the market reaction to them suddenly saying, we're not going to change the rate of income tax, when there were projections, some of them which were exaggerated, as it turns out, relative to the numbers we got in the end. But there were some projections out there from various economics groups suggesting that the situation the Chancellor confronted was really, really, really bleak. And then suddenly one of the big levers she was toying with pulling, she's suddenly saying she's not going to pull. And so they used that line about tax receipts as an attempt to reassure the markets that actually the numbers were not as bleak as some might have assumed them to be.
And then this became an issue for the Prime Minister today, as you were insinuating a minute ago, Dharshini, because he was doing a speech today which was meant to be setting out all the good things as he saw it that the government had done in the budget, previewing some of the potentially good things the government might do about cutting red tape and cutting the welfare bill. But inevitably, once it came to questions from political editors, they were all about this. And Chris, let's listen to the question you put to the PM and hear his answer in full so we can then dissect it.
As a former lawyer, you'll be familiar with the concept of people offering the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Isn't the reality that in failing to be candid about the breadth of what she knew at her pre-budget news conference, the Chancellor misled us?
Well, look, on the build-up to the budget, let me just step through that in some detail, because there was no BR productivity review. The result of that was there was £16 billion less than we might otherwise have had. That's a difficult starting point for any budget. We had already made commitments, which I think I've expressed to you and many others many times over, that we were going to protect our public services, particularly the NHS, to cut borrowing costs and to bear down on the cost of living. So we had on the one hand £16 billion less than we might otherwise have had. We had clear commitments that we'd made throughout the process as to what it was we were going to achieve. Therefore, against that backdrop, it was inevitable that we would always have to raise revenue. So there's no misleading there. During the overall process, the numbers improved. And there was a point at which we thought, myself included, that we might have to reach for a manifesto breach of some significance. I didn't want to get to that place, but I recognised we might have to. As the process then continued, it became clear to me and others that we might be able to do what we needed to do with our priorities without that manifesto breach. And that's what we did with the fair and necessary decisions that we took, which did, to root back to where I started, made good on the principles, which was protecting public services and the NHS in particular, where record amounts have gone in, and hence the waiting times coming down, which did help with borrowing costs, because I was determined that we needed to have bigger headroom than we had last time, and we more than doubled it, which has been very significant part of the budget, not easy to do for obvious reasons. And we were able to, and are able to, bear down on the cost of living, hence the £150 off people's energy bills, and the measures we're able to take in relation to the two-child benefit. So the review put us in a bad place to start with. We worked through our principles. There was a point at which I thought we might have to breach the manifesto. I was always wanting to know if there are alternatives to that, and the point came when there was an alternative to that, and that's the route that we took. Thank you very much on that issue.
Chris, give me your take on what the Prime Minister said.
A Prime Minister anticipates a particular sequence of questions in a news conference when, in answer to the first one, and I was privileged enough to be called first today, he sort of reaches for his notes and has an answer that is prepared. And he absolutely had that. So what did he do? He acknowledged, as I mentioned, publicly for the first time that they were seriously contemplating smashing their manifesto commitment on income tax, and in the end didn't need to. And obviously we were reporting that at the time, but there was the Prime Minister saying it on camera. And it's his argument that they were not misleading, because he says, look, this situation was pretty tricky, not least because of the productivity stuff. And then he had a bit of a pop at the fact that sort of, the music had stopped on their watch this year around all of that, accepting that's just the way it is, but also flashing a little bit of frustration at how that had in and of itself made things harder for them. And as I say, in and of itself, it clearly had. He did sort of in passing acknowledge that there was other data in the mix, but they are absolutely of the view that it wasn't misleading because they confronted a situation that was that because of productivity was tricky.
Dharshini, obviously this has got big political consequences.
Yes.
It's consuming Westminster at the moment, and some people will think that that's a ridiculous consequences of all of this. Some people will think it's very important. Are there economic consequences of all of this?
There are, and I think there's a few things we should say about this. And number one, first of all, just to clarify, because a lot of people looked at the forecast that the OBR had given to the Chancellor ahead of her putting any measures in and said, hang on, you're on track to get a surplus. You're on track not just to meet the fiscal rules, but to have a bit left over. So surely there is no black hole. That is simply not correct because that rather confusing, what we call the pre-measures forecast didn't take account, and this wasn't addressed today because clearly it's something that ministers don't want to talk about that much, of the U-turns that had happened on welfare in particular, which took many billions of pounds to compensate for, and that is something that she did have to find the money for. And on top of that, as we heard from the Prime Minister several times, there was this issue of going, we would have only been meeting the rules by a very small margin, and that would have been as risky with the financial market. So there was a need to raise money in some cases, and to do eventually what we got was pretty much bang on with what economists were ultimately expecting once those expectations had been changed. But along the way, what we did get as well was that uncertainty and this need for transparency, the twists and turns. We felt like pieces of fusilli, didn't we, or some other piece of pasta by the end of it, because we'd all been through the ringer so many times in trying to work out what on earth was going on. This whole sort of transparency and the idea that certain measures might be considered, etc., and people thinking perhaps they're going to go as far as income tax, what else are they going to touch? Economists are really worried that possibly has had real-world impacts when it comes to businesses investing, when it comes to creating jobs, when it comes to consumer spending or doing things like housing transactions. Now, if that is the case, some of that might just be people putting off decisions till they knew what was actually happening. But there is a case for thinking as well that contributed to what's happened to the economy over the last 2 months, and some of it may not come back and may also dampen confidence going forward. So, there are real-world implications for all of this. It's not just, a sort of a bun fight happening in Westminster by any means.
And Chris, what could be some of the political consequences of this bun fight where you are?
Well, in the very short term, it meant today there was much more focus on the bun fight than the Prime Minister talking about his outlook on the European Union. So he made a very broad, intriguing remark about our relationship with the European Union as part of a desire for greater economic growth.
Not very precise, though, was it?
It was very broad brush, and it was no longer than what I've just said. But it's interesting, and there's a trend of ministers, including the Prime Minister, doing that.
Not very precise, though, was it?
No, it wasn't. And it was no more detail than what I've just said. There was just a sort of passing reference to it. Then he talked about regulation and how the left, he said, often is associated with liking regulations on businesses, rules and regulations. But in his view, that there should be a sort of keen awareness of where regulations might get gold-plated, and there needs to be a greater desire to sort of strip those back where possible. Again, not much detail. And then also talking about welfare and talking about benefits. And if you like, the second strand of his benefits arguments, the first one was the scrapping of the two-child cap that we heard about last week. The next one is about, he says, the moral mission, as he sees it, to see particularly a greater number of younger people who are perhaps not in employment or work or training or education. I said employment and work, they're the same thing, aren't they? But in so doing, can he get to the point where the situation with the benefits bill can be addressed, because the projections suggest that it is heading up and up and up and up. So that's where he wanted to go with the conversation today, and he did talk about it in the speech, but it's sort of been rather overtaken. The sort of final thought I'd have on this, when does the word budget stop featuring on Newscast for a little while? Soon, I'm hoping.
The next budget.
Is that
Christmas
I think
Day,
the Prime
we're not
Minister,
on.
Are we not on? I thought you'd be doing it. I thought you'd be doing at least a 9-hour special or something. Is I think there's genuine pride from the Prime Minister today in what they announced in the budget. But then privately, from senior levels down, there is a sort of acknowledgement that the process running up to it, and then arguably some of the process since, has just been really messy. And what can they do to try and avoid that kind of thing happening again?
Just a little side note that I, on the way to buy my Christmas tree on Saturday.
Oh yeah, real one, I hope.
Bumped into.
Was it a real one?
It is a real one.
Okay,
Yeah. The chair of the Treasury Select Committee, Meg Hillier.
Did she help you carry
Who was
it?
leafleting. No, because she was leafleting her
right.
constituency. And so obviously I asked her all these questions we've just been discussing. She was
Did you?
incredibly
Was this with a
tight-lipped.
tree over your shoulder?
No, this is before I'd picked it up.
It's always really prickly, isn't it, when you carry
Yeah.
them? They've got that netting around them.
Wear
or whatever,
gloves.
you know?
Wear
Is it
gloves.
shedding
Wear
already?
gloves. And Meg Hillier was very, very tight-lipped about all of this, as you might imagine. But she did remind me that Rachel Reeves will be in front of the Treasury Select Committee being asked all of this on Wednesday, the 10th of December at 10 o'clock.
Yes, a week on Wednesday.
Yeah.
So we'll still be talking about the budget then.
So I suspect we probably will, yeah. And even if there's a lull now, it will pick up again a week on Wednesday. Anyway, Chris, thank you very much.
Ta-ra.
And Dharshini, thanks to you too.
Thank you.
What do you have on the top of your Christmas tree?
Nothing, because it's a 6-footer and it's got a very tall bit at the top where there's no room for a star
so it's
or an
pushing
that's
angel.
a
against the
shame.
roof.
It's pretty much brushing the ceiling, yeah.
We've got a troll.
Not enough headroom.
Oh, very good.
It's a
Very
budget Christmas
good.
tree.
That
It
is
was not budget.
tremendous.
The US and the UK have done a big deal concerning drug pricing, and the bare bones are these. The US will not apply import taxes, tariffs, on imports of British-made pharmaceuticals for 3 years. And in return, the NHS in the UK will pay a bit more for pharmaceuticals and also relax some of the rules when it comes to deciding if new drugs are good value for money for the NHS. And this has been quite a big bone of contention between the US and UK governments, the drug companies and the NHS ever since pharmaceuticals got wrapped up in Donald Trump's big old tariff imposition that he did on the whole world back in the spring. So let's talk about what is actually in the deal and what it means and why we ended up here in the first place, because we're joined in the Newscast studio by BBC business editor Simon Jack. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Adam.
I'll get your reaction to the latest goings on at the OBR. Not normally a sentence we say in a minute, but this deal with the US on pharmaceuticals. So let's break it down. What is the UK getting from the US in this transaction?
So the UK is getting from the US an agreement not to put tariffs on pharmaceutical exports to the US, one of our biggest, £5 billion a year, for at least the next 3 years. Now, there are no tariffs currently in place, but it was widely expected they were on their way. They were in the post. And this is a protection for one of our most important industries, crown jewel of our industry, that won't happen during the Trump presidency. So, as you can imagine, the UK pharmaceutical industry and the government both welcome that as great for business.
Well, because pharmaceuticals, in terms of our goods exports every year as a country, it's double-digit percentage of the total, isn't it?
It's right up there with cars as the number one export that we export to the US. So absolutely critical. And not just that, but also, the government has prided itself on declared its ambition to be a life sciences superpower. And recently, things have not been panning out that way. A long-running dispute between the drug companies and the NHS about whether they spend enough, particularly on new medicines, approve enough new medicines, and this dispute with the US, where the US saying, we're fed up of paying 3, 4, 5 times more for our drugs than you do in Europe and in the UK. We're subsidising all you guys. That's got to stop. Those two things have been weighing on the pharmaceutical industry, and we've seen some big ones like AstraZeneca pausing a project in Cambridge. They cancelled a project in the Northwest. You've seen American companies. Merck walked off site of a £1 billion development. And for a country that wants to be considered a life sciences superpower, this was getting pretty embarrassing. And there are 4 parties to this. There's the NHS and the government, and there's the pharmaceutical industry and the US, and they've been locked in this kind of round-robin negotiation for a long time. I think the budget was the thing that got this over the line, in the sense that the UK government needed to know what are they going to spend on the NHS, how much of that could be earmarked for new medicines, and that had to wait till the budget. The question is, will the NHS end up spending more money?
Yeah.
Yeah. The answer to that is almost certainly yes.
Yeah, well, which then brings us back to what the UK has offered in this transaction. So there's a few bullet points there, isn't there?
Yeah.
So let's run through them.
So what they've said is, at the moment, and this hasn't changed since the 1990s, the amount that the NHS watchdog, NICE, which decides whether a drug's too expensive for use on the NHS, has held those somewhere between 20 and 30,000 for every year of quality of life. So if a drug costs more than £30,000 a year and it's not going to get you much extra life, it's not been available on the NHS. They're going to move that window from 25 to £35,000 in the hope that more drugs will make it. This is for new medicines. Also, the UK government has always had this kind of rebate that it gets. The NHS has had a rebate. Because we're such a big customer and we're a volume buyer, we get a rebate on everything that we sell. Now, that rebate was getting very high. It was over 20% last year. They've agreed to cap that rebate that they send back to the drug companies at 15%, because the drug companies were saying, do you know what? We're just not going to release new drugs here because you don't approve them fast enough, you don't pay enough, we'll take them elsewhere. There are drugs available in Scotland which aren't available in England and Wales.
So that's kind of two percentages to get our heads around then. 15%, which is the new cap on how much drug companies might have to give back to the NHS
rebate,
in this rebate.
Yeah.
And then NICE's changes to make their thresholds more generous for what is an affordable drug.
Well, in stock
has that
terms,
gone up then by 25% then?
Well,
That's
it's gone from 20 to 25, so 25% at the lower end, and from
Yeah.
30 to 35, so 17% at the higher end. And in stark terms, it's like, what does the NHS overlord, if you like, the NICE, consider an extra year of life worth? Haven't you moved it for a very long time? They're moving it up here. Now, some people will say, I saw the Lib Dems describing this as a Trump shakedown of the NHS, that we're going to be paying more money. What the government would say to that is that better medicines, properly applied, all that kind of stuff, will keep people out of hospital. They'll pay themselves. And don't forget this: the amount of the NHS budget that goes on medicines has gone from 15% about 15, 20 years ago to 9% now. Compare that to 15% in Germany, 14% in France. So we are paying less in medicine costs relative to our health costs than most other developed countries.
So actually, in the recent past, even though the demand for healthcare has gone up,
Yeah.
new drugs seem to be getting more expensive as they get cleverer all the time. Actually, the percentage we've been spending on medicines as a percentage of the overall health budget has gone down quite a lot.
Massively,
Right.
yes, and that has been a real bugbear. That's why we've had this long-running dispute between pharma companies and the NHS and the government. The thing that has galvanised this entire debate, which has been going for years, has been an angry Donald Trump who issued something called a Most Favoured Nation declaration, which said, we don't want to pay more than you, we all want to pay the same. Now, the other win the government will trump on this one, if I can use that word, will trumpet on this one, is that that's not the case. UK customers will still pay less than in the US, but there is some sort of blended way they can kind of fudge this to keep the US happy. And they seem to have done enough. And another feather in the cap, I might say, in political terms, for Varun Chandra, who's our chief trade negotiator, a lot of people's favourite to be the next ambassador for the UK to the United States. He will have done his chances of getting that job no harm at all, because
He's currently based in Downing Street.
He is. He's moved into number 10. He gets on like a house on fire, it seems, with Jameson Greer, trade representative in the US, and Howard Lutnick, the trade secretary over in the US. So quite good credentials if you're going to go and be the US ambassador.
And quite often, British government press releases in this area are full of superlatives like Britain gets the best, Britain is the first. And actually, in this case, it does look like Britain's deal is quite unique compared to other countries.
This is a win for sure. I mean, it was. I think that at a 0% tariff, or like no tariffs at all, was better than most people expected. Because there were threats that would be 100% at one point from Donald Trump. He always, goes bigly on these things at one point and then comes down. But I think zero tariffs will be seen as a win. And, hopefully the government thinks will try and stem the tide of the lack of investment or the exodus of investment we've seen from drug companies who've cancelled projects here. And by the way, spent big in the US. AstraZeneca, $50 billion over the next few years. GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, $30 billion over the next 5 years. They're hoping that basically they'll stop moving out. Is it too soon to reverse or restart pause projects or reverse like Merck, the US company moving away? too soon to judge, I'm told.
Well, so that's what I've not been sure about the last few months when you see all these headlines about drug companies cancelling or postponing investments in the UK. I was never clear the extent to which it was a pull to the US by Donald Trump demanding that they do that, or a push away from the UK because of something our government was doing to make it less attractive to be here. It's a bit of both, though, isn't it?
It's a bit of both.
Impossible to say which percentage on each.
I'll have a go.
Please do.
70-30, pull to push. I think the push has been there for a very long time. Suddenly all happened. That gives you the evidence that the pull in the room is suddenly exerting a great influence.
Right. We've covered the breaking news about the OBR with Chris Mason and Dharshini earlier on. What's your take on Richard Hughes leaving the OBR?
Well, I can't say it's a surprise. He's the kind of guy who I think would, if you were playing cricket, for the cricket lovers there, if you nick...
Careful with this analogy, please. Do one that I'll understand.
Okay, if you know something, you're at fault, or the organisation you lead is at fault, then he was the kind of guy who would probably walk, as they would call it in cricket terms. Sorry about this, Adam. Some people will understand it.
I'm getting it.
Okay. And it's going to be very interesting. I'm just trying to ponder what the next budget's going to look like, aren't you? I mean, for example, if
the OBR website will be password protected to an inch of its life.
That's for sure. The OBR was set up by George Osborne, of course, to sort of keep politicians honest about what they were promising in their budgets. A lot of people would say that it was the tail that began to wag the dog. There's been a lot of, debate about whether it's become all too powerful. OBR, Richard Hughes, some people would say, was running the country because, a junior official at the OBR, by a sheer stroke of their keyboard, could basically change
some changed assumptions.
Could change fiscal policy 5 years from now and what we're going to spend on the NHS. So, you can argue it's very important to have someone keeping score. And by the way, when Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng chose not to have them keep score, that was certainly part of the meltdown that we saw there. I don't know. I'll leave it to my distinguished colleagues in the economics department to have the final judgment.
Anyway, Simon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. We recorded some bonus material, which you can listen to in the podcast edition, which is available to download now from BBC Sounds. And we will be back with another Newscast very soon. Bye-bye.